Today, on March 24th, 2014, we have a little surprise. Due to the recent death of Jerry, we will not be showing The Jerry Show, but instead we have something even greater. Today we are going to be talking about the Industrial Revolution. Now, without further ado, we present the Industrial Revolution with your host, Lee Carver, on JBS, your local Joey television station. Hello. It is a beautiful night tonight, but instead of going out tonight, you've decided to stay in and grade videos. So I thank you for staying with us this evening. Tonight we will be presenting a tale of struggles and new beginnings for men as encompassed by the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was the introduction of new manufacturing processes from about 1760 to sometime between 1820 and 1840. There were many new techniques introduced, including going from hand production methods to machines, efficiency of water power, the increasing use of steam power, and the development of machine tools, and the change from wood to coal as a fuel. There were many causes of the Industrial Revolution. One cause of the revolution was the enclosure movement. The enclosure movement was a movement in the 18th century where rich farmers had less workers due to new technologies being introduced to agriculture. The former farm workers would eventually make up the working class of the Industrial Revolution. Another one of the big causes of the revolution was timing and society's mutual relationship between industry and science. This proved to be a huge factor in the Industrial Revolution because of the powerful relationship between the two factors. One example of this is through puddling. Puddling revolutionized the industry because of the fast nature of iron making due to puddling. Science helped the industry. The Agricultural Revolution could also be classified as one of the causes of the Industrial Revolution. The Agricultural Revolution had a surplus of food supplies produced, so the population increased. This could be tied into the role of women at the time as well, as many women stayed at home and had kids. Therefore, the population increased, and as time went on, the Industrial Revolution started with a new generation of children, and the advancements of technology. The Industrial Revolution causes could also be tied into gender and social structure. The middle classes started to become business owners, and the upper classes became factory owners. This caused the lower class to become factory workers. The factory and business owners needed money, and that caused lower class workers to migrate into the cities for job opportunities, and the Industrial Revolution began. Other causes of the Industrial Revolution include population booms, rich natural resources, new technologies, new transport systems, urbanization, and a market for goods. During the Industrial Revolution, many new ideas were introduced to the world. Some examples include the spinning jenny, a spinning frame invented in 1764 by James Hargreaves. The device reduced the amount of work needed to produce yarn. With a work able to work 8 or more spools at once, the number grew to 120 spools as technology advanced. Also, the water frame, a water-powered spinning frame patented and developed in 1769 by Richard Arkwright. Arkwright was the leading entrepreneur in the early Industrial Revolution, often being labeled the father of the Industrial Revolution. There was also the cotton gin, a machine that quickly and easily separates cotton from its seeds, allowing for much more greater productivity. The cotton gin was invented by Eli Whitney, an American inventor. The cotton gin was one of the most important inventions, and it economically rejuvenated the South. The telegraph was introduced in the Crystal Palace, a building hosting the Great Exhibition of 1851. A telegraph that uses electrical signals conveyed through telecommunication lines or radio. The electric telegraph was invented by Samuel Morse. Morse was a former painter that became an inventor who was also the co-developer of the Morse code, and helped develop the commercial use of telegraphy. Perhaps the most important invention of the time was the steam engine. The steam engine is an engine that performs work using steam. It was invented by Thomas Savery. There were other figures in the Industrial Revolution. One figure in the Industrial Revolution was Josiah Wedgwood, a prominent abolitionist and the founder of the Wedgwood Company. He is credited with the industrialization of the manufacture of pottery. Another important figure is James Watt, a Scottish inventor and engineer who improved the Newcomen steam engine. Watt's changes proved to be fundamental to the changes brought by the Industrial Revolution. Alessandro Volta was also a big, important figure. Volta was a physicist turned inventor known for the invention of the battery in the 1800s. It's easy to see that there were many important technologies introduced in the Industrial Revolution, but there is still the question of why the Industrial Revolution started in England, though, and we'll find out after a message from our sponsors. You might be missing a finger, or 2, or 10 from working in the factories, but that doesn't mean you can't have a smile that's pretty. Choose Crest. Crest. Smile on. We are back to answer that question as to why the Industrial Revolution started in England. Why don't we ask an entrepreneur? Well, to answer your question, Lee, the Industrial Revolution started in England because of several things. Number 1, the Agricultural Revolution. The Agricultural Revolution was a large increase in agriculture in England due to increases in labor. Agricultural output allowed the population of England to extend 5.5 million for the first time. The Agricultural Revolution freed up labor, and it is often cited as one of the causes of the Industrial Revolution. Number 2. New financial ideas. New ideas such as central banks and stock companies let us take risks with things such as technology. Number 3. New transportation methods. A good friend of mine, Adam Smith, the first modern economist, once wrote that good canals, roads, and navigable rivers, by diminishing the expense of carriage, put remote parts of the country more nearly upon a level with those in the neighborhood of the town, there upon the account of the greatest of all improvements. These canals make it easier for my workers to carry out raw materials. Number 4. Coal and iron. Coal and iron are resources extremely prevalent in Britain. We use our coal in machines and locomotives. Our favorite ours is coke. Coke is made from coal. It has few impurities and is usually made from coal, so we love using that. 5. Our government policies. Our government policies let us use our intellectual properties that come from our patents, so we get a lot of money. Our navy also gives us monopolies that let us explore the world. Number 6. Our cottage industry. Our cottage industry served as a transition that relied on wage labor, cloth production, tools, and rudimentary machines, and a market to buy and sell raw materials and finished products. The cottage industry worked in a putting out fashion where there was the production of goods in homes under the eyes of the merchant who put out the raw materials, paid a certain sum per finished piece, and sold the completed item to a distant market. Those are just a few reasons of why the Industrial Revolution started in England. Thank you for that explanation. The Industrial Revolution starting in Britain definitely had some effects on the country, especially the early parts of the Industrial Revolution. One effect the early Industrial Revolution had was urbanization. People moved from towns to cities and to get closer to factories. Conditions were very poor during the early part of the Industrial Revolution as factory workers lived in overcrowded buildings. There was no sewage or sanitation services. This resulted in widespread disease. Working conditions were also bad as factory workers worked very long hours for little pay under harsh conditions. Workers included children as young as 8, both male and female. Many people were injured and killed due to unsafe working conditions. It's easy to see that the early Industrial Revolution had some very negative effects, but conditions would generally become better as new regulations came into effect. Even though early effects were not positive, there was a lot of financial stimulus in the Industrial Revolution's biggest industries: coal mining, iron, and steel production. Iron and steel production proved to be one of the most important industries because it allowed production of new items that used iron. Coal mining was also a huge industry during the Industrial Revolution. Coal was used in railroads and steam engines at the time, so coal proved to be extremely important. Both iron production and coal mining were huge industries as they allowed other industries to prosper. Now it's time for another word from our sponsors. Is working in the factories getting you down? Uh-huh. Turn that frown upside down with Orbit Gum. Orbit Gum, for when the only limb you have left is your head and you need to chew. Hello, we are back. The next thing we need to talk about tonight is mechanization. Mechanization means to change a job so that it is done with machines instead of by people or with animals. Mechanization was a fantastic thing during the Industrial Revolution as it proved to have some major advantages. Such advantage was that work performed through labor-saving devices could be done at much greater speed than work done by human workers. This allowed for production at record-breaking speeds. Another advantage of mechanization was that machines didn't have to be paid money. This allowed factory owners to produce even greater products for less money. For these two reasons and for many more, mechanization proved to be one of the best things to come out of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution may have started in Great Britain, it certainly didn't stay there. In fact, it could be argued that the Industrial Revolution was more influential in the US than in Britain. One of the most prevalent effects of the Industrial Revolution in the US was in the South. In the South, cotton was so abundantly produced that it was referred to as the Cotton Kingdom. Another new idea that came from the Industrial Revolution was the idea of universal male suffrage, the idea to let all men vote, whether rich, poor, disabled, or a landowner. This was revolutionary as America was now a new democracy. Another idea that was present during the transition between Britain and the U.S. was the idea of division of labor. Division of labor separated people who worked in certain areas instead of where everyone used to work together. People were assigned to work different tasks depending on their skills. While there were many great advances during the Industrial Revolution, one of the greatest advances was the steam engine. The steam engine improved both the U.S. and Britain in a number of positive ways. The steam engine allowed for quicker communications. The steam engine also allowed for mass movement of people. The steam engine allowed a lot more productivity to be done, and that was key in the Industrial Revolution. Therefore, the steam engine is perhaps the most remarkable innovation of the Industrial Revolution. Throughout the Industrial Revolution, there were only two modes of transportation. The first was taking a carriage, and the second was the railroad system. Throughout the Industrial Revolution, there were also many different characteristics in the early railroad system. Throughout the Industrial Revolution, trains proved to be extremely vital to the transportation of the working class. At the time, every train was powered by coal. The railroad industry was one of the first big businesses in the U.S. Railroad technology was a quickly evolving industry, with trains for everything from the cab to the caboose had to be made by hand. Railroads proved to be one of the best forms of transportation, with trains still being used to this day. With that, I think it's time for another message from our sponsors. Are you tired of slaving away in the factories every day? Do you get that 2 o'clock crash? Well, then you need Red Bull. Red Bull, it gives you wings. But be careful that you don't get ripped off by the cotton gin. The Industrial Revolution proved to shape numerous cities in numerous different ways. One effect the Industrial Revolution had on cities was through business cycles. The Industrial Revolution definitely forced many places to go through business cycles because of the fluctuations in the economy during the Industrial Revolution. Another effect of the Industrial Revolution was that in cities the population got very large. Because in a lot of cities, people moved to be close to the factories, a lot of cities became extremely dirty because of the Industrial Revolution, and living conditions got worse. The Industrial Revolution also affected cities through the public transport system. After the Industrial Revolution started, there was a boom in the use of public transport, as people would use it to get to their factories. There was a lot more sickness in the cities after the Industrial Revolution began because more diseases were introduced to the cities as people came in from the countryside. After the Industrial Revolution began, a lot of business owners hired new people, and wages and conditions got lower. A lot of women in the city started to work during the Industrial Revolution because jobs paid low amounts of money, and for a lot of women, this was the only way to support themselves. In a lot of cities, there was exploitation of children through child labor. Child laborers didn't have to be paid much or at all, so a lot of business owners exploited them for the smallest, and many children in the city were forced to work. In cities, better schools were developed because many children didn't see their families as often, so they needed new schools to be taught in instead of the home. New literacy forms were beginning popular in cities, especially books about the working and living conditions in the Industrial Revolution. While everybody was affected by the Industrial Revolution, none were affected as much as women and children. Throughout the Industrial Revolution, there was a major shift in the working class of both women and children. From this point on, women and children could no longer depend on the man in the house to be all their support. Women started to work in factories alongside men, and that also meant that women could no longer be around as often to support their children. That meant children had to work as well. Children got treated even worse, as they could easily be exploited. Children had small hands, so they risked mutilation because they had to reach inside the machine. Children also got little family time, so long periods of time would go by where children never saw their parents. Working conditions proved to be awful for women and children, but there were laws that tried to ease the conditions. One such act was the Factory Act of 1833. The Factory Act of 1833 attempted to establish a regular day in the textile industry. The act stated the following: children from 14 to 18 must not work for more than 12 hours a day with a lunch break. Children from 9 to 13 must not work more than 8 hours a day with an hour lunch break. Children 9 to 13 must have 2 hours of education per day. The act also outlawed the employment of children under 9 in the textile industry. Children under 18 couldn't work at night, and it also prohibited routine inspections for factories. Another set of establishments for both women and children were the Mine Acts of 1842. The Mine Acts of 1842 related to the employment of women and children in the coal mines. The act protected women and children under the age of 10 from having to work in the coal mines that were located underground. The influence of women and children in the Industrial Revolution was a powerful one, but it was not positive, as it had women and children working more than they had in a long time. It is undeniable that all classes were involved in the Industrial Revolution, and while everybody was involved in the Industrial Revolution, there was really only one class who was the real beneficiary of the Industrial Revolution, and they were the middle class. One reason for this is because in Britain, landowners had a lot of wealth and influence. In the 18th century, a new group of the middle class arose, entrepreneurs whose money came from manufacturing. Their businesses were usually self-financed, and not much money was needed to start a cotton or machine building business. In the 19th century, some newly rich industrialists bought their way into high society. The same happened in Western Europe in 1815. One example of influence in the middle class can be seen in the Corn Laws. The Corn Laws protected cereal producers in the UK from competition, but their laws were eventually repealed. The middle class overwhelmingly proved that they were the beneficiaries of the Industrial Revolution. Throughout the Industrial Revolution, many people such as Adam Smith tried to explain the Industrial Revolution through economic standpoints. Two of the most influential of these men were Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo. Malthus and Ricardo attempted to explain the poverty they saw without challenging the basic premises of laissez-faire, an economic environment where private purchases are free from government restrictions, with only enough regulations to protect property rights. Malthus and Ricardo said that the cause of the workers' dangerous situation was the population boom, which overtook the food supply and led to falling wages. They also said the workers' poverty was a result of the natural law as the wealth of successful businessmen. They said the only way that the working class could avoid mass famine was to delay marriage and practice self-restraint and sexual abstinence. What Malthus and Ricardo mean by their theory is that they see the problems of the Industrial Revolution could be led to the population boom. They also meant that the workers' poverty was due to low wages and that the workers should stop having kids to increase productivity. Malthus and Ricardo proved to be very popular in their beliefs as they saw the glaring problems with the Industrial Revolution. Ladies and gentlemen, the time has come yet again for another word from our sponsors. Are you tired of walking to the factory where you slave away for hours every single day? Then you need the train. The train is the new revolution for the public transport industry. Powered by your coal, you can get to your job even faster. Paid for by the British Public Transportation Office. The impact of the Industrial Revolution, without a doubt, struck the world as gargantuan. There were varying ideas that transformed the way the world worked. The transportation industry changed forever with the railroad. The railroad got everyone where they wanted to be quicker than with horses or walking. The technology of the world got transformed with all new inventions such as the steam engine and the cotton gin. Communication was transformed for the first time. One single person could get their ideas across broader scales without having to rely on other people to help them. There were many varying responses to the impact of the Industrial Revolution. There was some negative criticism to the Industrial Revolution. One example of such negativity came from the group called the Luddites. The Luddites were a group of skilled weavers and other pre-industrial artisans who saw the new textile machines destroyed the foundation of their craft. Another man named Robert Owen also saw negativity in the Industrial Revolution. Owen tried to incorporate a new utopian socialism, an idea that was the first ideas of socialism. Owen said that the people were generally not being treated equal and that everyone should be treated equal. The reception wasn't all negative, though. Many people saw the Industrial Revolution as very positive. One example is that it created jobs for the jobless. Another positive influence is that it brought a lot of new technologies such as the steam engine came out of it. The impact of the Industrial Revolution could also be seen at the birth rates. At the height of the Industrial Revolution, the average woman had 6 children. This is a large number, even compared to today's standards. The Industrial Revolution also had an impact in the food supply patterns. During the Agricultural Revolution, the food supply patterns were extremely high. They led to a huge population boom, but there was eventually a problem. After a while, the food supply was growing slower than the population was, and that caused a lot of people to go hungry during the Industrial Revolution. The impact of the Industrial Revolution could also be seen in the battle of laissez-faire capitalism, positivism, and socialism. And utopian socialism. Utopian socialism took a very strong influence from the theory of utilitarianism, where ethics that have the proper course of action maximizes utility. Positivism, which is based on the view that information taken from logical treatments and reports of sensory experience is the source of all knowledge, recommended that the poor should form workers' communities under the protection of the benevolent business leaders. Positivism provided rational ideas for investing in modern items such as railroads and canals. Laissez-faire, on the other hand, was free from influence and wanted landowners to do whatever they wanted, and that led to arguments over which side was the correct in its ideas. The Industrial Revolution changed an average man's life forever. Before the Industrial Revolution, people might have only had a small amount of a particular item. For example, a man might have only had 2 shirts before the Industrial Revolution, but as new sewing technologies came along during the Industrial Revolution, a man might have had 30 shirts after the Industrial Revolution. Before the Industrial Revolution, many people had to make their own food, but the Industrial Revolution changed because now food could be bought in stores. Before the Industrial Revolution, almost everybody relied on themselves as power sources, such as using candle waxes for light, but after the Industrial Revolution, many people used coal and steam as power sources. The Industrial Revolution proved to change the entire world with a new focus on technology, and it's easy to see that the daily life changed quite a bit after the Industrial Revolution struck. In the Industrial Revolution, there were really only 2 different types of women. There were the women in the upper and middle classes, and there were the women in the working class. There were some huge differences between the 2 women, but there were also some similarities. One key difference between the women was that women in the upper and middle class didn't have to work nearly as much as the working class women. Women in the working class had to work for up to 18 hours at a time with little or no breaks. Women in the upper and middle class, however, didn't have to work as hard because their husbands were usually business owners, so many women stayed at home to tend to kids. Women of the upper and middle class also tended to conform to the cult of domesticity, a value system that emphasized new ideas of femininity and a woman's role to her house. Another difference was that the impact of the Industrial Revolution on the classes of women. Working class women were transformed the most, as before women used to not have jobs that much, as generally they did cleaning work, but the Industrial Revolution forced many women to work hard jobs and the transformation was large. Women in upper and middle classes also had very small transformation. Women had kept the same formality as they had before, and as previously mentioned, worked the same as they used to. The women were similar in some ways, though. Women of all 3 classes generally had children that they needed to be tended to. Women were also similar in the fact that a lot of them joined the same labor unions with each other. Overall, though, women in the upper and middle classes generally had a better life during the Industrial Revolution. than that of the working class women, but it's very obvious that women were a key part of the Industrial Revolution. Well, that is about all the time we have for tonight. I want to thank you for watching our program tonight, a night where you forcibly had to grade video projects. This is Lee Carver representing JBS, saying good night.